As I say, my name's Giulio. I am from Italian background. So in this discussion of colonisation, growing up in Britain, I'm aware of the country that I came from colonised this country 2,000 years ago. And there were pagan and tribal cultures here. And that Roman culture also colonised the mainland of Italy before it. I'm from a part of Italy in southern Italy, near a place called Benevento, which has its roots in ancient witchcraft and paganism, which was colonised by the Romans as well. So the title of my talk is Colonising the Sacred, the Biopolitics of Psychedelic Healing and How to Respond. So I have to unpick a couple of those words. I have been part of the psychedelic community. I've noticed over the past few years that I grew up in a working class background in London, but having got a degree in cultural studies, in English literature, and studied Marxism and postmodernism, feminism, post-colonialism, I then ended up working at The Guardian, which is an ostensibly middle class and upper middle class environment. I often felt quite alienated in those environments. And when issues like war came up, I found myself quite at odds, and I needed the money, but at the same time, I felt very uncomfortable working at the Times. And I've been also in the psychedelic communities and noticed, as I have to acknowledge, that the vast majority of people involved in the psychedelic renaissance are from affluent backgrounds, often white affluent backgrounds, who then study science. And the scientific aspect has become more prevalent over the past few years. The idea was that we would be moving towards decriminalization at the very least. But what I've noticed happening is that the can has been kicked along the road, so to speak, and the scientists and medical people are continually telling us that we need more information, we need more safety protocols. And I don't want to name names this time, I have done in the past, but certain prominent scientists who are very much on that what I would call a reductionist way of looking at things, breaking things down to their constituent parts, are now coming for the spirituality. As Vanessa mentioned in her talk, that is the mindset of it is a colonial mindset. And I want to just trace the history of why that has happened, or at least why I think that may have happened, and what perhaps we can do about it to challenge it. So the first slide is to define colonialism in science and politics. So we know colonialism in terms of the military and how it has colonized the world, 3/4 of the world in the case of the British Empire, and then in the case of the post-war American Empire, because it was still an empire which presented itself as the natural order of things, a liberal democracy. It was called by many radicals of the African tradition, a writer like Frantz Fanon, as neo-colonialism. So it presents itself as a much softer version, but essentially it's imposing a worldview. We see in terms of what happened in the Middle East with Iraq in the most obvious way, imposing the idea of liberal democracy. So I think if we wanted to trace the origin, obviously the Roman Empire has its own form of imposition of how we look at the world, but the 16th century in Great Britain was a culmination of various upheavals and revolutions. The first one is the split in the Christian church. Up until that point, the Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, starts to take over Europe, and Catholicism is the Christian normalization of how society is ordered. But as Britain is starting to develop as a nation after the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, I'm sure most of you will be aware of Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, and his separation, wishing to marry again, and the Catholic Church banning him, and eventually separating from the Catholic Church, which creates a series of wars, civil wars, and really a nationwide trauma of various factions of Christianity which are wrestling for control and domination, eventually leading up to a civil war where the king is beheaded. Shortly afterwards, not more than 50 years afterwards, there is integration of the aristocracy once again. A new king is brought in, but this time it's called the Restoration period. It's a slightly different version. The king or the crown is no longer completely in control. There is a representative democracy. But it coincides with the development of science, and particularly the scientific revolution, which really starts to take off in the 16th century, and which leads also to the industrial revolutions. Now, slavery existed in the past, colonization existed in the past. What is specific about this revolution is it scales it up to an enormous degree. Suddenly you have slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and it's off the scale what it does, and Britain as a nation becomes all powerful. It defeats the previous empire of the Spanish Empire in the Spanish Armada, pulls back. The Spanish is obviously known for its invasions and the Portuguese obviously in South America and in parts of India and Asia, but the British Empire is a kind of off the scale, large scale, kind of coinciding of technological advancement, a specific type of religion, which I was studying for a time at Bath University, a subject called environmental humanities. There are specific writers called eco-feminist writers. The prominent one that I read was The Death of Nature by Carolyn Merchant, and she does mention this split, this split in a Christianity which becomes more reasoned, which takes away the feminine aspect of the Madonna figure, and which removes those qualities of intuition, of compassion, of nurturing, and there is a split between man and nature. So this is. We talk about a trauma. This is kind of a trauma that's happening in the midst of the British psyche, coinciding with this massive development and creation of wealth and power. So you're carrying your trauma throughout the world, which is what the British Empire did. Building the rail network in India. This is all for accumulating wealth. And the British Empire is massively successful, and obviously devastatingly successful, because it's destroying cultures around the world and presenting not just its power as self-evident, but presenting science and a way of presenting science as self-evident. So this is not to attack the scientific method, which is a tool which works in a very effective way to understand the physical natural world. The advancements in technology are undoubted, but what it does is the institutions that are created in that time, the Royal Society, use their political power, use science to justify their political power and their idea of it being self-evident. So I'll move to the next slide. So I wanted to just, again, why I use the term biopolitics. Biopolitics was popularized by the philosopher Michel Foucault, who was around in the 70s, is controversial, called a postmodernist, though he would never describe himself as a postmodernist. But he started to interrogate the idea that institutions themselves that present themselves as subjective are actually political ways of exerting political control. So educational institutions start to formulate in this time, the classroom, prison network, the way the society disciplines those who step out of line. And what's stepping out of line in this case is to use religion, it's a morality, is to step out of line, is to go outside the scientific model of reality, and even the model of God, which is now no longer someone that you use a priest to intercede with, but God is someone that you can process in your own way, which dovetails with the gentleman who was asking earlier with capitalism, because this is the growth of capitalism, the power of the British banks and the European banks, but particularly Britain. And Foucault analyzed that. He called it biopolitics and biopower. So this is how these institutions exert control but present themselves as neutral bodies. Giorgio Agamben is a more recent discovery, and he is a philosopher, an Italian philosopher, again, controversial because he's not outright on the left, but he's certainly not on the right. He interrogates institutions as well. He speaks of a particular term, and he fell foul of a lot of people on the left during lockdown because he has a theory called the state of exception, and which he presented, really popularized around the time of 9/11, and that is that governments, when presented with a state of emergency, an emergency arises where the state feels threatened, can introduce powers which undermine civil rights that have been established in those democracies. Once that state of exception in America is the creation of Homeland Security, it very rarely reels back. So that once those are imposed, Agamben talks of this term he uses, homo sacer, which it was an ancient term used by Romans which directly translates as sacred man. But homo sacer was a term that actually he calls bare life. It happened in the Roman times, and he believes it's another version that happens today, is that once you've decided that someone is outside your remit of control, especially in the state of exception, someone steps out of line, for example, with terrorism, making a joke at the airport, you can take away that person's right to exist. Now, homo sacer, I don't want to get too into the fields of it. It's sacred man. In Roman times, it meant that the person could not be sacrificed in any sacred way, but they could be killed by anybody at will. Now, it's not quite the same. It does happen with terrorists, and the idea that when someone is accused of terrorism, you can take away their rights. You're seeing it in America now with Trump, taking away various people's rights because new laws are imposed. Who controls the right to define and administer healing and to what end? The reason I use that is that in the time I've been around following the psychedelic renaissance, I've noticed that the scientists, again, understandable because of the way they've presented their findings, have started to encroach on ideas of what is right, what is wrong in terms of psychedelics, what is safe, what is not safe. They're exerting their rights to be, we are the fonts of all wisdom. Once you have defined that, there is really stepping outside their remit of philosophy, of culture. You'll very rarely hear these prominent scientists discussing politics. There's been a deathly silence in the last 2 years in terms of discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict. Especially as, you know, the attacks on October the 7th involved ravers at the Nova Festival, and there's been a lot of conflict in not wanting to discuss this. But if we're dealing with substances which can open us up to various modes of thought which challenge mainstream thinking, then surely that should be a natural discussion that should be happening. And there is a silence. And I found myself online arguing with various scientists, and they'll celebrate the latest development, the latest funding for the latest experiment. I say, well, what about discussing the politics of this? Why are we still in a situation where we have we have prohibition? We haven't moved on in 15 years. All that's moved on is there's more and more scientific models, there's more and more scientific investigation, but it's as if 15 years ago, when I went to my first conference in 2004, Exploring Consciousness in Bath, there was a move. We had cannabis downgraded, mushrooms were in this semi-legal state, and there was this feeling that prohibition was being challenged, and we're very close. It's as if it doesn't exist, it feels to me now. It's as if that's been given up. Steve Rollers mentioned, who's the head of Transform Drugs Charity, mentioned the fact that the psychedelic community has not seemed very keen to talk about decriminalisation. So I think that's all biopolitics. It's about how we use these substances, and what's very much happening is the scientists and medical people, obviously with many exceptions here, who are doing some quite pioneering work, but generally those scientists are saying it needs to be in-house. We can tell you how this should be administered. And there's the kind of, again, not always open, but kind of sneering at indigenous use and spiritual use. We'll let them get on with that, and we don't want to encroach or be accused of racism. But really, if anyone does it here, it's very easy to sneer at New Age cultures and medicine circles and talk about appropriation, but the real appropriation is the corporate capitalist mindset which wants to commercialize this. So So I call it colonial science, and it came to me, I wanted to make an impressionable kind of headline, but I think there's no other way to describe it. It's tricky to talk it colonial because there's going to be the pushback. There's this whole anti-woke movement now that even to mention any kind of, human rights is suddenly now, well, you're just being woke. So if you mention colonization, if you mention white supremacy, as I did at the start, there's also a pushback and you attacking white people. Well, no, you're talking about a system and how it operates in an invisible way and seemingly benign and seemingly objective. So how do, I believe absolutely indigenous spiritual traditions, but there are also urban and rave spiritual traditions which are totally erased and considered flaky. It's very easy to sneer at that. And there are obviously dangers in between in all of these. I was at an investigative talk yesterday about the Manson murders and how that ended the hippie revolution in the 60s, because it was such a powerful effect in the way it was reported. The idea was that, look at these hippies, this is what hippies can do. And that was it. And they were the person investigating, I've forgotten his name, did suggest and make an implication that it was a psyop. It was almost the best way to undermine the hippie movement, is to have a complete crazed man to bring people under his wing, and ostensibly it was supposed to be LSD had turned these people into killers. But actually it was LSD mixed with amphetamine. It's a possibility. But despite all of that, it's the way it functions. And I'm noticing this with journalists at the moment, and I will name names here because they're prominent journalists and they're very successful and their reporting is specific. But someone like Jules Evans, who does report on ayahuasca cults, etc., and I understand why that's necessary, but at the same time, what it has an effect of doing is to keep everyone thinking, well, the spiritual side of things is all a little bit flaky, and we don't want to lead to abuse everywhere, so let's just keep it in-house, keep it in the medical establishment. That's totally safe. Well, there's institutional, we see what happens. The first thing that what people want to do, and what I've been trying to do with the venture capitalists, is to commercialize it. Once science has categorized it, commodified it, it can sell it back to us. And it can't do that with spirituality because it can't be put in a box. I talk about the ineffable experience. I've talked to Andy Letcher about this. It's science can't quite. The hard problem of consciousness, spirituality. They're trying to find a thing, and any indigenous tradition or any kind of spiritual tradition of any kind will tell you that consciousness pervades reality. It's in every religion and culture. But the scientist is not happy with that. A particular type of scientist is not happy with that. I'd call them reductionist. They will get upset when I say that, but they want to put everything in a box. Once you put it in a box, it can be commodified, it can be sold back to us, and you have, like someone said yesterday, the ayahuasca pill that you can take and have your ayahuasca experience and move on. I call it the false pragmatism of capitalist realism. So it's the idea that capitalism is the only game in town, and the best way is we just go along with it. Sorry, it's the best of all possible worlds. We can't do anything about it, so let's just go along with it. I've had those discussions with prominent psychedelic scientists, and to me, that's not good enough. It's just, we have to have this radical hope that we can change it, or else we might as well just give up and stop pretending that this is going to lead somewhere positive. So again, institutionalizing psychedelic healing, it's being brought in the institution, the medical institution, even psychotherapeutic institutions. It's saying there have to be certain bodies. Of course, you need accountability. I think, to me, the most important part in any of this is that there should be accountable structures, safeguarding. If anything goes wrong, there's someone that you can go towards who can find some form of accountability. But often risks are used as the example of why these should be kept prohibited, because the risks are what would happen if someone loses their mind. Well, there are risks in all the medicines. I took sertraline, and I've suffered from anxiety recently through various things that I went through in the last year or so. My mother died a year ago, and I finally relented after many years and took sertraline for 3 weeks. And I know some people use it, and it's powerful for them and it works for them. It was the most horrible physical experience for 3 weeks that I had to just relent and say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm sorry, to the doctors. And I use cannabis. I said to them as well, we don't know anything about that. and we can't really help you. We know it exists. I said, it's an imperial college. And again, by the way, imperial college, if you want to understand that the institution still exists, imperial college symbolically, the Royal Society, that's not, it's true. And so we are surrounded by it, and we're like a fish in the sea, not being able to know what water is. It's all around us. So accessibility, £6,000 for an Ibogaine retreat is not ever going to be scaled up. And no matter what Rick Doblin says about net zero trauma, it's a fallacy. And I'm not accepting that as and I've had, again, I'm on LinkedIn and connecting with all these psychedelic therapists. And I say, hi, do you know, I mentioned the political stuff, and they said, oh, it's really terrible. You can have a reduction, £5,000. It's like, well, yeah, how about we allow to grow the mushrooms and the cannabis, just those two plants in Europe, and there's no problem. And we were almost there. We were almost there 15 years ago, and it seems as if we've gone backwards. So accessibility to me is the key, managing risks and accountability for any kind of abuses that happen. And so I've come to the last slide. I don't know if I've got solutions, but decolonizing psychedelic healing, again, being aware of when colonization's happening, I was going to wear a t-shirt, I didn't want to be too provocative, but decolonize the mind. I absolutely agree. All of us have that ability where we suppress that side of us which is wilder, which wants to challenge, which wants to flow. We have techniques and ways of moving this energy through us, whether it's psychedelic healing, whether it's spiritual yoga, Buddhism. As I said, get away from the idea of cultural appropriation within the people and think of it in terms of how is this being appropriated by a system that wants to extract and make a profit out of it, and that's the issue. So reprioritize decriminalization as the solution to an urgent mental health crisis. We know we've got an urgent mental health crisis. The doctors know that SSRIs are kind of patchy in terms of how they help. We know that there's enough scientific information. Thank you, scientists, for bringing that up and for showing us. But now you've done your work, and we don't need that much more information. I'm not saying they should stop doing their research. I'm saying we should stop prioritizing them as more funding for more research to find out specifically what area of the brain is being enacted. We just know that when we're in circles and we're sharing and telling stories, we're having a positive effect. And, it doesn't need any more than that. But in order to do that, we have to challenge these systems and how they operate. Zoe, I can't remember her surname, the Green Party candidate who was in the London Assembly, spoke yesterday how when she brought the subject of the Green Party has of decriminalisation, a particular police commissioner suddenly changed his whole body posture and said, oh, we're going to have crack in the shops then. And it's that kind of attitude which is a colonial attitude. It's saying, I'm the person in the dominant position, you have to jump through hoops to prove to me, and they'll continually have us jumping through hoops as they have been for 20 years. So I would say challenge these, what I would call puritanical colonial attitudes. There are risks with everything, but it's a puritanism that came out of that Christian period and which transferred, the most extreme versions of those Puritans went to America. So America, settler colonial state, was founded on the most extreme versions of that Christian mindset, and armed with all of this scientific and technological knowledge, the absolute eradication of the buffalo herds, done in double quick time. No connection to the animal as sacred. Completely misunderstanding the nature of what they were. They had this heaven of land that the native people of that land were willing to welcome them in, and they eradicated, subjugated. We know the story. It's still denied for many people. So the final bit, and again, it's not a solution, but establish the sacramental value of psychedelics beyond the reductionist, corporatized healthcare. So we have to keep doing it and keep saying this is not the remit of the scientists to talk about this. They won't want to stop it, but we need to collectivize and say, you know what, there are certain things that we wish to preserve without your interference, or at least with respectful collaboration, if that's what you want to do. Thank you. Thanks.